Jake Williams never imagined his life would change because of a bet. At 28, he had everything anyone could dream of: a successful career in real estate, a mansion in the hills, a sleek sports car, and a circle of friends who all envied his charm and wealth. But despite all the luxury, Jake felt an odd sense of emptiness. He'd spent his life proving his worth through money, status, and accomplishments, but deep down, there was something missing. The one thing Jake had never truly understood or cared about was love. That's why, when his best friend, Nick, dared him to take on the most ridiculous challenge he'd ever heard of, Jake agreed without a second thought. "You think you're untouchable, right?" Nick asked, grinning over his glass of whiskey at a lavish party in the penthouse. "So, here's the challenge. Marry an obese woman. Not just any woman, but one who's, let's say, out of your league. Do that, and I'll pay you $1 million. And I'm not talking about just any wedding, I mean the real deal." Jake chuckled, clearly amused. He had no interest in women who weren't slim and fashionable, so the thought of marrying someone with a body type considered less than perfect seemed laughable to him. "Are you serious?" Jake replied, his voice dripping with mock disbelief. "I could do that easily. It's no challenge." Nick leaned in, his smile widening. "I'm not sure you can. I think you're too focused on the superficial. If you can marry someone outside your type, someone who's been overlooked, someone who doesn't fit the mold, then you'll prove that you've got more depth than just your looks and your money. Maybe then, you'll finally show us all that there's more to you than meets the eye." The comment hit Jake like a slap to the face, even though it was said in jest. A challenge like this? It wasn't about love, or even liking the woman. It was about proving a point. It was Jake's opportunity to show everyone that he was right. He could get anyone, no matter their shape or size. The bet was a game, and Jake always won his games. "Fine," Jake said, taking a gulp of his drink. "I'll do it. I'll marry someone who doesn't meet your expectations, and I'll do it in the next month." The room erupted in laughter, and Nick shook his head in disbelief, thinking Jake was being too cocky. But to Jake, it was just another way to prove that his charm, his wealth, and his status were all he needed to win. Little did he know, the moment he agreed to this ridiculous bet, his life would never be the same. The next day, Jake found himself scrolling through dating apps, his mind racing with the possibilities. He wasn't really looking for anything beyond a casual date, someone who'd be willing to take on this challenge for the sake of his amusement. He didn't care about personality or interests. What mattered was finding someone who fit the profile Nick described, someone unexpected. Someone who wouldn't match the perfect woman he usually went for, skinny, fashionable, and admired by society. That's when he saw Maggie. Her profile picture was of her sitting in a park, wearing a casual sweater and jeans, with a genuine smile on her face. Her round cheeks and fuller figure weren't what Jake usually found attractive, but there was something about the way she carried herself that piqued his curiosity. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just herself. Her bio was short but sweet, just a girl who loves reading, good food, and bad rom-coms, looking for something real. Jake swiped right without hesitation, setting the wheels of the bet in motion. He didn't expect her to respond, but much to his surprise, Maggie messaged him back within hours. "Hey, Jake. I'm Maggie. You seem interesting. What's your idea of a fun weekend?" Jake's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. He was used to women fawning over him, but Maggie's response felt different. She wasn't asking about his wealth or fame, she was just asking a simple question. It threw him off a little. "Hey Maggie, nice to meet you," he typed back. "I'm just looking for someone to enjoy life with. How about you?" They exchanged a few messages, and despite Jake's initial intentions, he found himself oddly fascinated by her responses. Maggie wasn't like the women he typically dated. She didn't gush over his success or flatter him with compliments. She was funny, insightful, and surprisingly down-to-earth. "I'm not really into fancy dates," Maggie said in one message. "I prefer something low-key, like grabbing coffee at a local spot, or maybe a walk in the park. Simple things make me happy." Jake couldn't help but smile at how refreshing this was. He wasn't used to someone being so real, so unapologetically themselves. But of course, this wasn't about liking her. This was about the bet. He reminded himself that this was a game, and it was one he was going to win. A week later, Jake arranged to meet Maggie in person. They agreed to meet at a small cafe, one of those places where the coffee was just as good as the atmosphere. Jake had no intention of getting emotionally involved, but something about Maggie intrigued him. He wanted to see what made her tick, how she would react to being a part of his bet. When Maggie walked in, Jake's breath caught in his throat for a brief moment. He had seen her pictures, but there was something different about her in person. Her presence was warm, and though her body was larger than the women he usually dated, there was a certain confidence in her walk that caught his attention. She wasn't shy or apologetic. She wasn't trying to hide her curves or be anything she wasn't. She was just Maggie. "Hi, Jake," she said with a friendly smile as she approached the table. Her voice was soft, yet carried an unspoken strength. "Hey, Maggie," Jake replied, trying to keep his composure. "It's good to meet you." They sat down and began chatting about everything from movies to childhood memories. Jake quickly found himself enjoying the conversation. Maggie had an incredible sense of humor and was easy to talk to. She didn't seem intimidated by his wealth, and she didn't treat him like a celebrity. She treated him like any other person. But deep down, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something more complicated than just a bet. By the time the meeting was over, Jake had a decision to make. He could stick to the plan and marry Maggie to win the bet, or he could back out and admit to himself that there was more to this woman than he had anticipated. As he walked back to his car, the weight of the decision loomed over him. Was he really ready to treat someone like Maggie as just a challenge? Or was something more beginning to stir inside him, something he couldn't quite define? Jake Williams, the millionaire playboy, was about to learn the hard way that some bets have consequences far greater than money. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake Williams sat in the leather chair of his office, staring out over the city skyline. His hands were clasped in front of him, as if he were trying to hold on to some fleeting thought. His thoughts, however, were scattered, a mix of the bet he'd made with Nick and the strange encounter with Maggie. That afternoon, when he'd met her for coffee, something had stirred inside him. He hated it. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He was supposed to be in control, always. But now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure. As he tried to focus on the work that sat on his desk, his mind kept drifting back to Maggie. Her smile. Her confidence. The way she wasn't afraid to simply be herself, without apology or pretense. Jake didn't understand it. He wasn't used to women who didn't fall at his feet. It was unsettling in a way that was hard to shake. But, Jake thought bitterly, this was just a bet. He wasn't supposed to feel anything for Maggie. This was just a way to prove to Nick, and to everyone else in his life, that he could get anyone, even someone who didn't fit the stereotypical, perfect woman mold. She was just a challenge. Nothing more. Jake pushed the thought aside and leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting to his childhood. He'd never really had the time or space to think about it, but now, in this moment, it seemed impossible to ignore. Jake grew up in a large, cold house on the outskirts of Chicago. His father, Richard Williams, was a powerful businessman who had built a real estate empire. Jake's mother, Linda, was a socialite who had spent more time at parties than at home. Their marriage, if it could even be called that, was built on mutual ambition rather than affection. Love was an afterthought. Jake had learned early on that his value in life came from one thing: his ability to succeed. His father had been proud of his business achievements but never once expressed pride in Jake himself. To Richard, success was the only thing that mattered: how much money you had, how many deals you closed, how powerful your name was. From an early age, Jake had been molded by that philosophy. He was taught that emotions and personal connections were weaknesses. People were tools. Resources to be used to get ahead. His mother had always been absent, caught up in her own world of parties and charity events. Jake's upbringing wasn't one of love or warmth, it was one of competition and cold efficiency. As a teenager, Jake had grown accustomed to using people to get what he wanted. He'd dated women, but they were always the kind of women his father approved of: blonde, tall, and slim. They fit the standard of beauty that had been drilled into his mind. He'd been with them because they were beautiful, not because he was in love with them. In high school, Jake was the golden boy. He played football, was the class president, and threw the best parties. But underneath the surface, he was always calculating. He wasn't just popular for his charm, he was popular because he understood how to manipulate his social circle. If you could make people like you, you could get what you wanted. And he did, he got everything he wanted. But despite all the friends, the accolades, and the success, Jake always felt an emptiness in his chest. A void that money couldn't fill. He'd never experienced the kind of closeness or real affection that some of his classmates had with their families. Jake had always been alone, even when surrounded by people. His adult life had continued along the same path. He'd gone to the best colleges, interned for prestigious firms, and eventually started his own real estate business. He'd built it from the ground up, using every connection and resource at his disposal. But no matter how many deals he closed, no matter how much money he made, something still gnawed at him. He had everything, yet it felt like nothing. Jake didn't do relationships. He wasn't interested in love, or at least, he told himself that. What he cared about was winning, always. And the women in his life had been nothing more than distractions, affairs, flings, and short-lived relationships. Women who were beautiful but shallow, just like he was. He hadn't ever let anyone close enough to see the cracks in his carefully constructed persona. That was why the bet with Nick had seemed like the perfect way to prove his superiority. He was confident that he could marry anyone, even someone who didn't meet society's standards. After all, his wealth and charm were all he needed. But then there was Maggie. She was different from the women he'd known. She wasn't intimidated by his money, nor was she interested in impressing him. She had a quiet strength about her that Jake couldn't ignore. She wasn't playing a game. She was real. Jake couldn't understand it. The bet had been about proving a point. But with Maggie, it was starting to feel like there was more at stake. And he didn't like it. As Jake sat there, staring at his desk, he heard a knock at the door. "Come in," he called out, snapping himself out of his thoughts. It was his assistant, Sarah. She handed him a stack of papers, but her eyes lingered for a moment, as though she could sense something was off. "Anything else?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Jake glanced up, trying to shake off his unease. "No, I'm good for now. Thanks." Sarah gave him a polite smile before leaving, but Jake couldn't help but feel the weight of her gaze on him as she left the room. He wasn't used to people reading him. He wasn't used to being so exposed. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the city below. The sun was starting to set, casting a warm orange glow over the skyline. The world looked peaceful from up here, but Jake knew better. Nothing in his life was ever peaceful. He had everything he thought he wanted, but something was missing. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if it was worth it anymore. That evening, Jake found himself thinking about Maggie again. Her smile. The way she carried herself with quiet dignity. She wasn't like the women he usually met. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just herself. And that made him uncomfortable. Jake hadn't expected to feel anything for Maggie. He hadn't expected to connect with her, let alone feel guilty about the bet he'd made. But here he was, questioning everything he thought he knew about himself. As much as Jake wanted to push it all aside and go back to his old ways, he couldn't help but wonder, what if there was more to life than winning? What if, for once, he didn't have to be in control? Jake knew he had to make a decision. The bet was just the beginning. But how far was he willing to go? And more importantly, what would happen when the truth came out? Jake's phone buzzed on his desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Maggie. Maggie, hey Jake, I was thinking about our coffee today. I really enjoyed it. I'd love to hang out again sometime soon if you're up for it. Jake's heart gave an unexpected skip. He wasn't used to feeling this way, this flutter of something he couldn't quite name. With every other woman, things had been predictable, manageable, and entirely based on superficial attraction. But Maggie? Maggie made him feel something different, something more real. He quickly typed a reply, trying to mask the uncertainty creeping in. Jake, hey Maggie. I had a great time too. How about dinner tomorrow night? I know a great spot. Jake stared at the phone for a few moments after sending the message, wondering why he'd agreed to meet her again. This wasn't part of the plan. He'd wanted this to be just a game, a way to show Nick he could pull off the ridiculous bet. But somehow, it didn't feel like a game anymore. There was something deeper to it. Something that felt both exciting and terrifying. Maggie's reply came almost instantly. Maggie, that sounds wonderful. I'll look forward to it. The next evening, Jake arrived at the restaurant early, as usual. He liked being early, it gave him control. He could settle in, look around, and mentally prepare himself for the night ahead. But as he waited, he found himself feeling oddly restless. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the anxiety that was slowly creeping up on him. He was Jake Williams, for God's sake. Why should he feel nervous? A few minutes later, Maggie walked into the restaurant. As always, she looked effortless, no heavy makeup, no flashy clothes. She wore a simple, elegant dress that hugged her curves in a way that felt natural, not forced. Jake noticed how comfortable she was in her own skin, how much she owned the space around her. There was something magnetic about her that was impossible to ignore. She spotted him at the table and smiled warmly. Hey Jake, she greeted him. I hope I didn't keep you waiting long. Jake stood up, pulling out the chair for her. Not at all, Maggie. I'm just glad you could make it. They exchanged small talk as they ordered their food, and Jake found himself genuinely enjoying the conversation. Maggie wasn't intimidated by the luxury of the restaurant or the fact that Jake could buy whatever he wanted. She spoke about her favorite books, her quirky hobbies, and even her childhood, sharing stories of growing up in a modest home with a family that loved her unconditionally. It was so different from Jake's own upbringing. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was talking to someone who wasn't trying to use him. She didn't care about his wealth or his success. She cared about him. Or at least, that's what it felt like. He realized he had been so accustomed to people only liking him for his status that this kind of genuine connection was completely new to him. After dinner, they decided to take a walk along the city's riverfront, the cool night air filling their lungs as they strolled side by side. The lights of the city flickered on the water's surface, casting a peaceful glow around them. I don't know if I've ever told anyone this, Maggie said softly, her voice barely rising above the gentle hum of the city, but sometimes I feel like people look at me and immediately judge me. They assume things about me because of how I look, and it's tiring. You know. Jake looked over at her, his heart heavy with empathy. He had never truly considered how it might feel to live under such scrutiny. He had spent so much of his life obsessed with appearances that he hadn't even realized how damaging those superficial judgments could be for others. I can't even imagine what that's like, Jake admitted, his voice sincere. I've spent my life being told what to do and how to look. But I get it now. It's hard to be yourself when everyone around you expects you to be something else. Maggie smiled, though there was a trace of sadness in her eyes. Yeah. It's a struggle. But, in a weird way, it also makes me appreciate the people who don't judge me. The ones who see me for who I really am. Not just my weight, or my looks, or my life situation. Jake's chest tightened as he processed her words. He had never been the type to care about anyone else's struggles. People were tools. But Maggie made him feel something deeper. She wasn't just a woman he was using to win a bet. She was real. She was meaningful. So, what about you? Maggie asked, breaking Jake's thoughts. What's your life like, Jake? What's really important to you? Jake paused, unsure how to respond. He had spent so many years defining himself by his success, by what people thought of him, that he hadn't even considered the question. What was important to him? I've never really thought about that, Jake admitted. I guess I've always just focused on winning, on being successful. But now, with you, I think I'm starting to question whether all that really matters. Maggie looked at him with a soft expression. It's okay to question things. Life doesn't always have to be about winning. Sometimes it's about finding the right people and the right connections. Jake's stomach churned, and his mind raced. This wasn't supposed to be happening. He wasn't supposed to be feeling this way, not with Maggie. This was supposed to be a challenge, a bet he could easily win. But the more time he spent with her, the more he realized just how much he'd underestimated her. Maybe you're right, Jake said, his voice quieter now. Maybe I've been focused on the wrong things for too long. They walked in silence for a few moments, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something huge. Something he wasn't sure he was ready for. Later that night, as Jake lay in bed, his thoughts were a whirlwind. The bet, Maggie, everything, it was all tangled up in his mind. He had no idea how this was going to end, but one thing was certain, he was no longer playing by the rules he had set for himself. And he wasn't sure if he liked it or feared it. Jake Williams had always been in control. But for the first time in his life, control felt like the thing slipping away. Jake couldn't stop thinking about Maggie. The night they'd spent walking along the riverfront kept replaying in his mind, each moment echoing louder than the last. He had spent his entire life building walls around his emotions, carefully crafting a persona that was impenetrable, smooth, and controlled. But Maggie? She had a way of breaking through all of it. The more he spent time with her, the more Jake realized he wasn't sure who he was anymore. Was he the guy who didn't care about relationships, who saw people as tools to be used for success? Or was he someone else, someone who could care about something or someone more than himself? Jake had spent his whole life being conditioned to pursue success at all costs. His father's relentless pursuit of wealth and power had been Jake's blueprint. He had never considered that there might be a different path, a path that didn't rely on power, status, or control. And Maggie had started to show him that. But none of that mattered. Not really. Because there was still the bet. The bet he'd made with Nick. It loomed over him like a storm cloud, waiting to break. He couldn't back out of it, could he? He had to follow through. He'd promised Nick. He'd been so sure, so confident when he made the bet. He had to prove to everyone that he could do it. Marry someone who wasn't perfect, someone who didn't fit the mold. A woman like Maggie. But as the days passed and he saw more of Maggie, Jake began to feel conflicted. She wasn't just a bet anymore. She was a person. She was someone with hopes, dreams, and struggles. Someone who, despite everything life had thrown her way, still believed in kindness and sincerity. And Jake? He was still trapped in his own game. But this game had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. The next morning, Jake sat in his office again, trying to focus on the work in front of him. But as the hours dragged on, he couldn't concentrate. His mind kept drifting to Maggie and the growing realization that maybe this wasn't a bet anymore. He needed answers. He needed to figure out where he stood, where this was all heading. He took his phone from his desk drawer, staring at it for a long moment before he typed out a message to her. Jake, hey Maggie, I've been thinking about us. I'm not sure where this is going, but I'd like to talk. I need to be honest with you about something. He hit send, heart pounding in his chest. The vulnerability was new, and it scared him. He wasn't used to putting his emotions on the line. He wasn't used to not being in control. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed again. Maggie, of course. I'll be home this afternoon. Maybe we can grab coffee. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been so eager to have a conversation with someone. But this wasn't just any conversation. This was the moment of truth. Later that afternoon, Jake met Maggie at a small cafe on the corner of a quiet street. It was the kind of place that felt warm and inviting, unlike the cold, corporate buildings Jake was used to. It felt like stepping into another world, one that didn't care about money or status. It felt real. Maggie was already sitting at a table by the window when Jake arrived. She looked up when he walked in, offering a gentle smile. Her eyes were warm, but there was something guarded in them now. Jake couldn't help but feel the distance between them, even though they were sitting across from each other. The weight of the bet hung over him like a dark cloud. He sat down and took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. He had to do this. He had to be honest. But could he? I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other night, Jake began, his voice low. About not judging people based on what they look like or what they have. I realize that I've spent my whole life doing that. I've used people, used situations, to get ahead. But with you, it feels different. Maggie's expression softened, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. I made a bet with Nick, Jake said, his throat tightening as the words left his mouth. I told him I could marry someone who didn't fit the mold. Someone who wasn't what society expects. I picked you. I thought it would be a challenge, something to prove a point. But now, his voice faltered. I realize it's not just a bet anymore. I've been getting to know you, Maggie, and he paused, struggling to find the right words. I'm not sure how to handle this. Maggie looked down at her hands for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She seemed deep in thought, processing what Jake had said. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. You're saying this was all just a bet? Maggie finally asked, her voice quiet but firm. That's how this started. Jake winced, feeling a wave of guilt wash over him. Yes. But it's not like I expected this to happen. I didn't expect to. Feel something for me, she interrupted, her eyes meeting his. Jake nodded slowly. Exactly. I didn't expect to care about you at all. But here I am. And I don't know what that means. I'm trying to figure it out, Maggie. Maggie's face remained unreadable for a long moment, and Jake could see the wheels turning in her head. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She was just thinking. But the hurt in her eyes was clear, even though she wasn't showing it outright. I don't know what you want from me, Jake, she said softly, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. I don't know if I can just forget that this all started as a game. But if you're really serious about me, if you really want something real, then maybe we can figure it out. But if you're just here because you have guilt, I don't know if I can do that. Jake's heart clenched in his chest. He had never been the type to get emotional, but in that moment, he felt the weight of his actions. The truth of what he'd done hung over him, and he knew that no matter how hard he tried to fix things, it wasn't going to be easy. He'd broken something, maybe even broken her trust, and it would take more than words to repair it. "Maggie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this. But I want to try. I don't want this to be a bet anymore. I want it to be real. I want you to know that." Maggie took a deep breath, her expression softening. She didn't speak for a long time, but when she did, her words were quiet but resolute. "Then show me, Jake. Show me that this is real." The words hung in the air between them, their weight heavy in the stillness of the cafe. Jake stared at Maggie, his mind racing. "Show me, Jake. Show me that this is real." She had said it so simply, yet with such depth that it left him reeling. How did he prove something like that? He had spent so many years building a life based on appearances, status, and wealth. But now, in front of him, was a woman who wanted more than that. She wanted sincerity, honesty, something real. Jake didn't know if he was capable of that. His entire life had been a game of controlling his image, manipulating situations, and making things work in his favor. But this wasn't a game. Maggie wasn't a pawn to move around. And for the first time in his life, Jake wasn't sure what to do. Maggie broke the silence, her voice gentle yet firm. "You don't have to do anything right now, Jake. I just need to know you're willing to try. You can't just walk away from this because it got harder than you expected. If you want something real with me, it has to start with the truth. I don't want half-truths. I want to see if we can build something honest together." Jake felt a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. He had always prided himself on being able to control his feelings, but now, as Maggie looked at him with such vulnerability, it all felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Could he really do this? Could he throw away everything he thought he knew for something as uncertain as love? "I never thought I'd be in this position," Jake admitted, his voice shaky. "You're right. This wasn't supposed to be real. It was a bet. But now that I've spent time with you, I'm starting to realize I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." Maggie's eyes softened, but she didn't speak right away. She simply nodded, as if letting the weight of his words settle into both of them. There was no anger, no bitterness. Just understanding. "But you have to know, Jake," Maggie continued, her voice quieter now, "I can't be a part of someone's game. I'm not going to play second fiddle to some bet, no matter how it ends. If you're serious about me, you have to let go of that past. Let go of what this was supposed to be and focus on what it could be." Jake swallowed hard. For the first time, he understood what it felt like to lose control. This wasn't something he could buy, manipulate, or solve with a clever plan. This was real. And he was going to have to learn how to navigate it without the comfort of certainty or control. "I promise," he said softly, "I'm not just here because of the bet anymore. I'm here because I want to see where this could go. I want to make it real, Maggie. I don't know if I can change overnight, but I want to try." Maggie gave him a faint smile, though her eyes remained guarded. "That's all I need to hear, Jake." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Jake found himself seeing Maggie more often, trying to understand the way she saw the world, without the filter of wealth or status. They spent hours talking about everything and nothing, and with each passing day, Jake found himself more and more drawn to her. Her honesty, her intelligence, and the way she carried herself with such confidence, it was all so different from the people he was used to. But it wasn't just Maggie who was changing. Jake was, too. Slowly, but surely, he began to notice the small things in life that he had always overlooked. He found himself questioning his old habits and beliefs, asking himself whether his quest for success had truly made him happy. Or had it just been a distraction? A way to avoid facing the deeper emotions he had buried for so long. Still, the bet lingered in the back of his mind. Every time he looked at Maggie, he felt a pang of guilt. How could he have treated her like a pawn in a game? She deserved so much more than that. And now, every moment he spent with her, the stakes grew higher. He didn't want to disappoint her, but at the same time, the weight of his secret, his original reason for approaching her, hung over him. Could he be honest with her about it now? Or would it ruin everything? One evening, as they sat at a park bench, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jake felt the need to speak his mind. They had been silent for a while, just enjoying the peaceful evening, but Jake could no longer keep the truth buried inside. "Maggie," he began, his voice low, "there's something I need to tell you. I haven't been fully honest with you." Maggie turned to look at him, her brow furrowing slightly in curiosity. "What do you mean?" Jake hesitated, his heart racing. This was it. The moment of truth. He had to come clean, even if it meant risking everything. "When I first approached you, when we first started spending time together, it wasn't because I was interested in getting to know you. It was a bet. A stupid bet I made with my friend Nick." Maggie blinked, surprised, and her face fell for a moment. "A bet?" she repeated quietly. "You mean to tell me that all of this, everything we've been through, was because of a bet?" Jake nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I know it sounds awful. And it was. I was wrong. I'm sorry, Maggie. I never meant to hurt you. I didn't think I'd actually care about you. I didn't think I'd feel this way." Maggie took a deep breath, her expression unreadable. She stood up and began walking slowly along the park path, leaving Jake to follow her. He didn't know if he should say anything more or just let her process. But after a long stretch of silence, she spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "You're right," she said. "It does sound awful. It sounds like you've been playing me the whole time. But I can't pretend I didn't feel something, too. I can't pretend I don't want to see where this could go. I just need to know that you're not going to treat me like a game anymore. That this is real for you." Jake walked alongside her, his voice almost pleading. "It is real, Maggie. I swear it is. I know I've messed up, but I want to make it right. I don't want to lose you." She stopped walking and turned to face him. Her eyes, though filled with uncertainty, softened as she looked at him. "Then show me, Jake. Show me that you're not just in this because of a bet." Jake nodded, knowing there was no going back now. "I will. I promise. I'll show you." Jake couldn't remember the last time he had felt so unsure of himself. The days following his confession to Maggie had been a whirlwind of emotions. Every time he thought he was making progress, he felt like he was taking 2 steps back. Maggie had listened to his apology and had not walked away, yet there was a coldness in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. She hadn't trusted him completely, and why should she? After everything, he had to prove that he wasn't just another person who took advantage of her, that he wasn't going to disappear when the going got tough. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized something. He didn't want her to just forgive him. He didn't want to be someone she settled for or trusted only because she felt she had to. He needed to show her that he could be the man she deserved, the man who could stand beside her as an equal, not a project or a problem to solve. Jake was used to fixing problems. His whole life had been about taking control, about turning challenges into opportunities. But this was different. This wasn't about money, power, or status. This was about trust, vulnerability, and proving that his feelings for Maggie weren't just a passing infatuation. The following weekend, Jake invited Maggie to spend the day with him. He had been planning it for a while, wanting to do something special, a gesture that would show her he was committed to making this work. He had been thinking a lot about her passions and what made her happy, and he wanted to create a day where she could see that he cared. They met at the small park where they had first talked, the same place where their journey had begun. It was a bright Saturday morning, and the sun cast a warm glow on everything. Maggie arrived, looking as beautiful as ever, though her expression was still guarded. Jake had noticed the hesitation in her steps, the uncertainty in her eyes. It was clear she wasn't sure what this day would mean for them, if it would change anything at all. "Morning," Jake greeted her, a little nervous but trying to keep his calm demeanor. "Morning," Maggie replied, giving him a small smile but not the kind that usually reached her eyes. "Are you up for an adventure?" Jake asked, trying to keep the mood light. Maggie raised an eyebrow, intrigued but skeptical. "What kind of adventure?" Jake grinned, a mischievous glint in his eye. "The kind that's all about you, Maggie. I've been thinking a lot about what you love, what makes you happy. And I'm going to do my best to show you I'm serious." Maggie seemed to soften at his words, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she just nodded and followed him as they walked down the path that led to a series of quaint little shops at the edge of the park. Jake had planned the entire day around things that Maggie had mentioned in passing. He remembered her talking about how much she loved nature, how it calmed her mind, and how she liked to paint as a way of expressing herself. So, that morning, he had arranged for them to visit a local art gallery, followed by a picnic at the park. He knew it wasn't much, but he hoped it would be enough to show her that he cared about what mattered to her. As they walked through the gallery, Jake noticed how Maggie's eyes lit up when she admired the paintings. She had a way of seeing things that he had never understood. The way she studied every brushstroke, every shadow, as if the art spoke to her on a deeper level than just aesthetics. It was beautiful to watch. "You have a great eye for art," Jake remarked as they moved through the rooms, her gaze lingering on each piece. Maggie smiled, but this time, it was warmer. "Thank you. It's something I've always enjoyed, but I never really had the time to pursue. Life kind of gets in the way." "I get that," Jake said, his voice thoughtful. "But it's never too late to start, you know. Maybe you should take some time for yourself and see where it goes." Maggie's eyes softened as she met his gaze. "Maybe." As they left the gallery, Jake surprised her by pulling out a small easel and a set of paints from the trunk of his car. "I know it's not much, but I thought we could try painting something together. Just for fun. No pressure." Maggie was silent for a moment, then let out a laugh. "You know, I never thought I'd hear you suggest something like this. But, alright, let's give it a try." They set up by the lake, surrounded by the natural beauty that Maggie loved so much. For the next hour, they sat side by side, each with their own canvas, creating something simple, yet meaningful. Jake painted a landscape, something serene and calming, while Maggie painted abstract strokes that were full of emotion. As the afternoon wore on, the tension between them started to dissipate. There were no more awkward silences, no more hesitations. Just two people, sharing a quiet moment in a beautiful place. And for the first time, Jake felt like he was actually getting to know Maggie, not the woman he had initially seen as a challenge, but the real person beneath the surface. The woman who had a passion for art, a love for nature, and a heart that deserved to be cherished. Later that evening, as they sat on a blanket near the lake, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Maggie turned to him, her eyes soft. "You know, I wasn't sure about all this at first. I didn't know if you were really serious or if this was just another way for you to get out of your guilt." Jake looked at her, his heart pounding. "I understand why you'd feel that way. I can't undo the past, but I want to show you that I'm here for you. Not because of a bet, but because I want to be. I want to know you, Maggie. All of you." Maggie didn't respond immediately, but after a long moment, she smiled, a smile that finally reached her eyes. "That's all I needed to hear, Jake." For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he could breathe. He had made mistakes, but this day, this moment, was a step in the right direction. And he wasn't going to take it for granted. The days following their time together at the lake felt like a turning point. Jake had hoped that the afternoon they spent painting and talking would create a lasting shift in their relationship, but he hadn't expected how much it would change him. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't just pretending. He wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't, or hiding behind his wealth, or trying to manipulate situations to his advantage. For the first time, he felt free. Free from the expectations of his social circles, free from the guilt that had been eating away at him. Maggie had been distant since that day. She was warmer, sure, but still kept a part of herself hidden. Jake could tell there was something on her mind. A barrier, just out of reach, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't break through it. But maybe that was just the nature of their relationship now. Maybe things couldn't just move forward so quickly. Maybe trust had to be built, brick by brick. Jake found himself thinking about her all the time, about her quiet laugh, her fierce independence, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about things she loved. He didn't want to rush her, didn't want to push her into a place where she wasn't ready to be. But there was one thing he knew for sure, he wanted her. All of her. And he was willing to work for it. One evening, after a long day of meetings and phone calls, Jake sat in his office, staring at the documents scattered on his desk. His mind, however, wasn't on the work in front of him. It was on Maggie. The quiet, enigmatic woman who had somehow managed to shake him to his core. Just as he was about to pick up his phone and send her a message, his phone buzzed. It was Maggie. "Can we meet tomorrow? I need to talk to you." Jake's heart skipped a beat. What did she want to talk about? He quickly typed back. "Of course. I'll pick you up at 6. The reply was almost immediate. "See you then." Jake leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. There was something about the way Maggie had phrased her message that made him uneasy. It wasn't just a casual chat. She needed to talk. That could mean a million different things. The next evening, Jake arrived at the cafe early, pacing outside as he waited for Maggie. The air was cool, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. His nerves were on edge, and he found himself replaying the day he had first met her, how different she had seemed back then, how guarded she had been. He knew she was still holding something back, but he wasn't sure what it was. And he didn't know if he was ready to hear it. When Maggie finally arrived, she looked a little different than the woman he had come to know in the past few weeks. Her face was pale, and her eyes had a weariness to them that didn't quite belong. She gave him a weak smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Hey," Jake greeted her, his voice soft but laced with concern. "You okay?" Maggie nodded, though it was clear she wasn't. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's just. I've been thinking about everything, Jake. About us. And I don't want to keep anything from you anymore. I think it's time you knew the truth." Jake's heart raced. He couldn't tell if he should be scared or relieved. Maggie was finally going to open up to him, but what if the truth was something he wasn't ready to hear? They sat down at a quiet table near the back of the cafe, and Maggie took a deep breath before speaking again. "I haven't always had it easy, Jake," she began, her voice hesitant. "I know you probably think my life has been full of opportunities, but it's been far from perfect." Jake nodded, his attention fully on her now. "I know things aren't always easy for people. But you've got to know that I'm not here to judge you. Whatever it is, I'm here to listen." Maggie took another breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "When I was younger, I had a lot of dreams. I was a different person then. But life, it wasn't kind to me. I've always struggled with my weight. And when you grow up as someone who's always been told you're not good enough, that people only care about what you look like, it changes you. I've spent so many years trying to prove people wrong, trying to make myself worthy of love and respect. And when I met you, I thought maybe, just maybe, you were different. But I couldn't help but wonder if I was just another challenge for you. Just another bet to win." Jake felt like the world had shifted beneath him. He had heard bits and pieces of Maggie's struggles before, but he had never fully understood what it had been like for her. How deep her pain ran, how much she had fought against the judgment and ridicule. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his heart breaking for her. "I never meant to make you feel like that. I never wanted you to think you were just a bet to me." Maggie looked at him, her eyes dark with emotion. "I know you didn't mean to. But sometimes, that's how it feels. That's how it always feels. And it's hard for me to trust people, Jake. It's hard for me to let anyone in when I've spent so much time building walls to protect myself." Jake reached across the table and took her hand gently in his. "Maggie, I swear to you, I'm not like everyone else. I've made my mistakes, but I care about you. I care about you more than I can say." She didn't pull away, but there was a stillness in her eyes. A part of her was still unsure, still scared to let someone in. And Jake knew that, more than anything, it wasn't about him anymore. It was about Maggie finding the courage to trust herself and others again. "I've been running from my own truth, Maggie," Jake said quietly, his voice filled with raw honesty. "But I'm not running anymore. I'm here. I'm right here, with you. And I want to do better. For you. For us." Maggie's eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she smiled. It was tentative, but it was real. And it made Jake's heart swell. "Maybe," she said, her voice small but hopeful, "maybe we can start again. No more games. No more walls." Jake squeezed her hand. "No more walls, Maggie. I promise." As they sat in silence, both of them processing the weight of the conversation, Jake knew that they were at the beginning of something entirely new. This wasn't about a bet. It wasn't about who had the most to gain or lose. This was about two people finding their way through the mess of life and learning to trust again. And for the first time in his life, Jake felt like he wasn't just chasing success. He was chasing something real. And that was a beginning he could get behind. The days after their heart-to-heart felt like a breath of fresh air for both Jake and Maggie. The walls that had separated them were still there, but they were no longer impenetrable. There was a sense of possibility in the air, something unspoken, yet present between them. Jake could see the gradual shift in Maggie's demeanor. She wasn't as guarded, though her past still lingered in her eyes. He could feel the weight of it too, but he was willing to help her carry it, as much as she would allow him. It was a Thursday evening when Jake invited Maggie to dinner again. This time, there was no pretense, no special gesture, it was just the two of them, sharing a quiet meal together. They had gotten past the awkwardness of their past interactions, and Jake finally felt like they were starting to build something real. He could almost feel the tension between them dissolving, little by little, day after day. They chose a small, cozy Italian restaurant on the outskirts of the city, nothing too fancy, just a place where they could talk without distractions. When Jake arrived, he saw Maggie waiting at the entrance. She was dressed simply, but there was something about the way she stood there, confidence, perhaps, or a sense of peace, that caught his attention. "Hey," he greeted her, smiling as he approached. "Hey," she replied, a soft smile curving her lips. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. "This place looks nice." Jake nodded. "I thought we could use something low-key, just to, keep things relaxed." Maggie chuckled lightly. "I think that's a good idea." They made their way inside and were seated at a quiet corner table, away from the bustling crowd. The ambience was warm, with the soft glow of candles on each table, and the faint sound of Italian music playing in the background. As they scanned the menu, Jake couldn't help but steal a glance at Maggie. There was something so genuine about her now, something he hadn't seen before. Maybe it was the way she didn't shy away from eye contact, or how she seemed more at ease with herself. So, Jake began as he set down the menu. "What's been going on with you lately? You've been quieter than usual." Maggie met his gaze, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. "I've just been thinking, I guess. About everything. About where we're headed, Anne. I guess, about my past. Jake nodded, trying not to show how much her words affected him. He had always known that Maggie's past weighed heavily on her, but hearing her bring it up so directly made him realize just how deep the scars ran. I get it, he said gently. We don't have to talk about it if you're not ready, but I'm here. Whenever you are. Maggie seemed to consider this for a moment. She looked down at her glass, as if gathering her thoughts. Then, slowly, she spoke. I've always had this fear, Jake. That if I let someone in, they'll eventually leave. Or worse, they'll realize that I'm not worth sticking around for. That I'm not enough. Her voice wavered a little, and for a moment, Jake could see the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. I never want you to feel like that, Jake said softly. I'm not going anywhere, Maggie. I promise. Maggie smiled faintly, but it was clear that a part of her still doubted him. And that hurt. But Jake understood. Trust didn't just happen overnight. It took time, and patience. He had to show her that he wasn't like the others in her past, the ones who had let her down. Their food arrived, and for a few moments, they fell into a comfortable silence, eating and enjoying each other's company. The air between them was no longer thick with tension, but light and easy, filled with the sound of quiet conversation and the clinking of silverware. So, what's something you've always wanted to do, but never had the chance? Jake asked, trying to steer the conversation towards something more positive. Maggie paused, thinking. I've always wanted to travel. To see the world, experience different cultures, and maybe even paint on location. I've always admired people who just pick up and go, without worrying about all the reasons why they can't. Jake leaned forward, intrigued. That sounds amazing. Why haven't you done it? She shrugged, her eyes dimming slightly. Life. Responsibilities. The fear of failure. All those things that get in the way. Jake's heart ached for her. She had dreams, big dreams, but somewhere along the way, life had told her they were out of reach. He wanted to change that. He wanted to be the one who showed her that anything was possible if you were willing to take the leap. Well, what if we did something about it? Jake asked suddenly, a spark of excitement in his voice. I'm serious. What if we made plans to travel together? Maybe we can start with a weekend getaway, just to see where it takes us. Maggie's eyes widened in surprise. You want to travel with me? Jake smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Yeah. Why not? I mean, it doesn't have to be anything crazy, just somewhere new. We can start small. I want to make those dreams of yours a reality, Maggie. Maggie was silent for a moment, her gaze searching his face as if she were trying to decipher his sincerity. And for a brief moment, Jake thought she might pull away, that she might find some reason to decline. But then she spoke. Maybe, she said softly, a small smile playing at her lips. Maybe that's not such a bad idea after all. Jake felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't much yet, but it was a start. They were beginning to build something together. Slowly, piece by piece. After dinner, Jake walked Maggie to her car, and as they stood by the door, he felt a sudden surge of affection for her, something deep and unshakable. He wanted to protect her, not just from the world, but from the insecurities that held her back. Good night, Jake, Maggie said, her voice quiet but warm. Thank you for tonight. Jake reached out and gently touched her arm, his fingers brushing against her skin. Anytime, Maggie. I'll always be here. And as Maggie drove off into the night, Jake stood there for a moment, watching her go. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. They were walking forward, together. The days after their dinner felt like a turning point in their relationship. Maggie had agreed to take that first step toward a future they could share, and it was enough to make Jake feel like the world was opening up for them. It wasn't a giant leap yet, but it was progress. And for someone who had been chasing after success in business, chasing the next big deal, this felt different, this felt real. It wasn't about winning a bet anymore, it wasn't about making a name for himself, it was about building something lasting with Maggie, something genuine. They had talked about the weekend getaway, nothing too extravagant, just a small cabin in the mountains, a place where they could escape the noise of the city and focus on themselves. Jake had been careful not to make it feel like a grand gesture, even though, in his mind, it kind of was. The trip was just a chance to take things slowly, without any pressure or expectations, and to explore the possibility of something more between them. A weekend in nature, away from the prying eyes of their respective worlds. It was a Friday afternoon when Jake pulled up to Maggie's apartment building. He had spent the last few days finalizing the details of the trip, making sure everything was arranged perfectly, from the cabin to the food, to the small touches that would make their time there more enjoyable. He had even packed a bag, ready to leave the city behind for a few days. He got out of the car, his heart beating a little faster than usual as he made his way up to her door. He hadn't seen Maggie all week, and something about the anticipation of the trip made him excited to finally spend some uninterrupted time with her. When Maggie opened the door, Jake couldn't help but smile. She looked radiant in a simple sundress, her hair flowing in loose waves around her shoulders. There was a lightness about her, an energy he hadn't seen before. "Hey," she greeted him, her smile brightening her face. "Ready for our weekend getaway?" Jake nodded, trying to hide his excitement. "I am. I'm really looking forward to this, Maggie." She raised an eyebrow, a playful glint in her eyes. "Yeah, me too. But I have to admit, I'm a little nervous." Jake's heart softened at her honesty. "It's okay to be nervous. It's a big step, right?" Maggie nodded, glancing away for a moment, as if collecting her thoughts. It's been a while since I've let myself relax, let alone go somewhere with someone else. I've always been so focused on what I don't have, that I forgot to appreciate what I do." Jake reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "Well, I'm glad you're here. Let's just take it one step at a time. We're here for each other, no expectations, no pressure." She looked up at him, and there was a vulnerability in her gaze that he had never seen before. It made him want to protect her, to shield her from all the hurt that she had experienced. But more than that, it made him want to see her shine. The drive to the cabin was peaceful, the road winding through dense forests and rolling hills, the world outside their car a blur of green and gold. The farther they drove, the more Jake felt like they were escaping the chaos of their lives. There was something calming about the quiet, the simplicity of it all. It felt like a chance to disconnect from the pressures of their world and just be. When they arrived at the cabin, Jake took a deep breath, savoring the fresh mountain air. The place was everything he had hoped for, cozy, secluded, and surrounded by nature. The cabin itself was nestled at the edge of a forest, with a wraparound porch and large windows that offered a stunning view of the valley below. There was a small creek that ran through the property, adding to the tranquility of the place. "This is beautiful," Maggie said softly, gazing around as she stepped out of the car. Jake smiled. "I'm glad you like it. I thought it would be the perfect place for us to unwind." They unloaded the car, taking their time as they carried their bags inside. The cabin had a rustic charm to it, with wooden beams and stone walls that made it feel warm and inviting. As they settled in, Jake set up the fireplace while Maggie unpacked their things. They worked together in a comfortable silence, and Jake found himself thinking about how easy it was to be with her. It was like they had fallen into a rhythm, a quiet dance that didn't require words. They were just, together. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Jake lit the grill outside, and they shared a simple meal of grilled chicken, vegetables, and fresh bread. The sky was streaked with pinks and purples, casting a soft glow over everything. It was peaceful, too peaceful for Jake's usual fast-paced life, but it felt right. He could feel the weight of the city, of his usual routine, slipping away as the evening unfolded. Maggie looked over at him, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Jake," she began, her voice quiet, "why did you pick this place?" Jake paused, setting down his drink. He hadn't really thought about it before. "I guess. I wanted us to have a chance to just be. No distractions. I thought this place would give us the space to do that." Maggie nodded slowly. "I appreciate that. It's been a long time since I've felt like I could just breathe." Jake watched her, his gaze softening. "I want you to know, Maggie, that whatever happens here, whatever happens between us, I'm not going anywhere. I'm in this, all in. And I'm not rushing anything. But I hope that whatever this is, it's real." Maggie's eyes met his, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that made Jake's heart skip. "I think it's real," she whispered. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of warmth and quiet conversations, punctuated by laughter and soft moments of shared connection. As the stars emerged in the sky above them, Jake and Maggie sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets, gazing at the vast expanse of the night. In that moment, Jake realized something. This wasn't just about a weekend getaway, or even about a bet anymore. This was about two people finding each other, and realizing that maybe, just maybe, they were exactly what the other needed. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't need to be. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The weekend passed in a blur of peace and quiet, far removed from the hustle of their daily lives. The tension between them that had once seemed insurmountable was slowly dissolving, replaced by something softer, more tender. Each morning, they woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside the cabin, and each evening, they shared stories beneath the star-studded sky, both of them learning more about the other, more about themselves. On the third morning, after a leisurely breakfast of eggs, bacon, and freshly brewed coffee, Jake decided they should go for a hike. Maggie had mentioned that she loved nature, and it seemed like the perfect opportunity for them to bond further. They set off down a narrow trail that wound through a dense forest, the air crisp and fresh. The sunlight filtered through the trees in soft beams, creating patterns on the ground that made the whole forest seem alive with light. Jake was ahead, guiding them, but he found himself constantly looking back to make sure Maggie was still with him. She was quiet, but her presence was comforting, like a steady beat in a song. "You okay back there?" he called over his shoulder, his voice light, almost teasing. Maggie smiled, though it was a small one. "Yeah, just enjoying the quiet. It's a nice change of pace." Jake slowed his pace to match hers, his hand brushing the rough bark of a nearby tree as they walked. There was something about the simplicity of it all, the way nature had a way of quieting the mind, the way time seemed to slow down here, that made everything feel more significant. More real. "So," Jake began, glancing sideways at Maggie, "have you ever hiked like this before?" She shook her head. "Not really. I mean, I've walked on some trails, but nothing like this. It's different, but I like it." He grinned. "Well, there's a first time for everything. Glad you're enjoying it." For a moment, they walked in silence, the only sound being the crunch of fallen leaves beneath their feet and the distant call of birds. It felt natural, easy, and Jake couldn't help but feel like he was seeing a new side of Maggie, a side she had kept hidden for so long, even from herself. "I used to come out here a lot, when I was younger," Maggie said suddenly, breaking the silence. "My parents had a cabin not far from here. We'd spend weekends hiking, fishing, just being together. It was always the best part of my childhood." Jake turned to face her, surprised by the honesty in her voice. "Sounds like a good memory." Maggie nodded, her eyes distant as if she was looking back at something that no longer existed. "It was. But, things changed. My parents divorced when I was a teenager, and after that, I don't know. It was hard to hold on to those memories when everything else felt like it was falling apart. Jake's heart tightened at her words. He had known about her troubled past, but hearing it from her directly hit him harder than he expected. It reminded him of how much she had endured, and how much of that pain still lingered beneath the surface. He wanted to reach out, to say something that would make it better, but he knew better than to rush her. Instead, he just nodded and offered a quiet, "I'm sorry, Maggie." She met his gaze then, her eyes softer than they had been before. "It's not your fault, Jake. It's just, part of who I am now. I've learned to carry it. I just don't always know how to let it go." They stopped walking for a moment, standing side by side on the trail, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. Jake wanted to say something profound, something that would fix it all, but instead, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in a long time. He just stood there, silently offering her his presence. It wasn't much, but it was all he could give. Maggie broke the silence with a quiet laugh. "I didn't mean to bring the mood down. Sometimes I forget how much these things still affect me. I thought I was over it, you know." Jake smiled gently. "It's okay. You don't have to be over it. And you don't have to carry it alone." She looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, Maggie seemed to see him. Not as the man who had made a bet, not as the wealthy businessman, but as someone who genuinely cared. The moment stretched out, and Jake could almost feel the shift between them, like something unspoken but profound was passing through the air. They resumed their hike, walking in companionable silence, but this time, there was a shift in the air. Something had changed between them, something deeper than just the surface-level connection they had been building. It was a quiet understanding, a recognition that they were both carrying pieces of the past, but they didn't have to let those pieces define them anymore. As they reached the summit, the view was breathtaking. The valley below was spread out like a blanket of green, the mountain peaks rising in the distance like ancient guardians. Jake had been up here before, but seeing it through Maggie's eyes made the moment feel different. He wanted to share it with her, to make her feel like she was a part of something bigger than just the walls she had built around herself. Maggie sat down on a large rock, gazing out at the view. "This is amazing," she murmured, her voice filled with awe. "It's like everything else just fades away up here." Jake sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "Yeah. It's pretty incredible, isn't it?" For a long moment, they just sat there, enjoying the beauty of the world around them. No words were needed, there was a peace between them, an understanding that had been built not just through shared experiences, but through the willingness to open up, to be vulnerable, and to trust. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jake turned to Maggie, his heart full. "Thank you," he said softly. "For being here with me. For letting me in." Maggie looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if she were trying to gauge his sincerity. "I'm glad I came. I didn't expect this, to feel so right." Jake smiled, feeling the weight of the past few days, the journey they had taken together, settling comfortably in his chest. "Neither did I. But I'm glad it does." They sat there, side by side, watching the last light of day fade away, knowing that this moment, in its simplicity, was the beginning of something new. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The peaceful weekend was a turning point for both Jake and Maggie, but as they drove back to the city, the tranquility of the mountains started to fade into the background of their minds. The real world was waiting for them, pressing, urgent, and unforgiving. For Maggie, that meant confronting the reality of her life outside of the cabin. For Jake, it meant dealing with the consequences of a past he had yet to fully reckon with. As they pulled into the driveway of Jake's apartment, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, but she wasn't sure what. Had the weekend meant more to him than just a getaway? Was she reading too much into the soft moments they shared? She wished she could hold on to the simplicity of their time in the mountains a little longer, but she knew they both had responsibilities, and reality had a way of making itself known when least expected. Jake parked the car and turned to Maggie, his hand resting briefly on hers. "Thanks for this weekend, Maggie. I really mean it. I feel like we got closer." Maggie smiled but couldn't quite meet his eyes. "Yeah, I feel that too." She exhaled slowly, gathering her thoughts before speaking again. "But I don't want to ruin things by rushing ahead. I need some time to process everything." Jake nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He wasn't rushing her, not anymore. "Take all the time you need, Maggie. I'm here, okay?" She nodded, squeezing his hand lightly before stepping out of the car. As she walked up to the entrance of her building, she felt a pang of doubt, but she didn't let it linger. The weekend had been beautiful, yes, but it also brought up emotions she hadn't expected to confront. She wasn't sure how ready she was to let someone in, especially someone as complicated as Jake. Back at his penthouse, Jake sat on his balcony, staring out at the skyline. The lights of the city glittered in the distance, and he found himself thinking about what he had said to Maggie. "I'm all in." He repeated the words to himself, but did he truly understand what that meant? Jake had always been able to control his life, his career, his investments, his social standing. But with Maggie, things were different. She wasn't someone he could simply manipulate or smooth-talk his way into. She was real. And that, if he was honest, was both terrifying and exciting. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking his train of thought. It was a message from his best friend, Ryan. "Ryan, you've been quiet. How's everything with the bet? Did you close the deal?" Jake stared at the message for a long time, his thumb hovering over the screen. He hadn't spoken to Ryan much since the weekend, and part of him knew that the reality of his situation was about to catch up with him. The bet. The reason he and Maggie had crossed paths in the first place. It had seemed so simple, just a way to prove a point, a win-win situation for him. But now, with the growing connection he felt toward Maggie, that same bet seemed like an impossible weight to carry. Jake's fingers tapped out a response, "It's complicated. I don't think I'm thinking about it the same way anymore." He hesitated before sending it, feeling a strange mix of guilt and anticipation. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the facade. Maggie spent the rest of the evening sorting through her own thoughts. After the hike, after their time at the cabin, she realized just how much she had buried deep inside, how much she had hidden from herself. The emotional walls she had built to keep people out were starting to crack, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure she knew how to hold everything together. She sat on her bed, scrolling through photos on her phone, trying to distract herself. But her mind kept drifting back to the weekend. To Jake. To the things he had said. Was he truly different from the man she had first met? Could he be someone who wanted to build a future with her, or was this just part of his game? Her phone buzzed with a new message, interrupting her thoughts. It was from her sister, Emily. "Emily, Maggie, I need to talk to you. Call me when you get a chance." Maggie's heart sank. She hadn't spoken to Emily in a while, too long, actually. The rift between them hadn't healed completely since their falling out months ago. Emily had never been particularly supportive of Maggie's decisions, especially when it came to relationships. Maggie had grown used to navigating life without her sister's approval, but something in Emily's message made her uneasy. She took a deep breath and dialed the number, waiting as the line rang. "Hey, Maggie said when her sister finally picked up. "Maggie, I need to ask you something." Emily's voice was tense. "Is it true that Jake Roberts is the guy you're seeing?" Maggie froze, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't expected Emily to know, but then again, she shouldn't have been surprised. In their circle, news spread fast. "What do you know about him?" "Enough to know that he's not who you think he is," Emily replied, her tone heavy with concern. Maggie, I've heard rumors. I don't want you to get hurt. Maggie felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew Emily wasn't always the most objective person when it came to relationships, but there was something in her voice that made her words hard to ignore. Rumors? Maggie asked, trying to sound casual. What kind of rumors? Emily hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Jake's been known to make bets with people. He's not the kind of guy who gets involved for the right reasons. He's only with you because of a bet, Maggie. Someone told me that he's trying to win a wager about you. The words hit Maggie like a ton of bricks. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed made her chest tighten with hurt. It felt like everything she had started to believe in was suddenly a lie. The connection, the moments they had shared, it all seemed to be built on a foundation of deceit. I need to go, Maggie said, her voice shaky. I'll talk to you later. She ended the call abruptly, her mind spinning with a million thoughts. Jake had betrayed her in the worst possible way, using her like a pawn in some twisted game. She had let herself believe in him, in them, but it seemed like everything was about to come crashing down. The next few days felt like a blur for Maggie. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't seem to answer. Every time she thought about Jake, a fresh wave of betrayal washed over her. She had tried so hard to be open, to trust him, only to discover that everything between them was built on a lie. The hurt was sharp, almost physical. How could she have been so naive? How could she have allowed herself to get so close to someone who saw her as nothing more than a challenge, a bet to win? She didn't want to believe Emily's words, but the more she thought about it, the more they made sense. The sudden shift in Jake's behavior after their weekend getaway, his willingness to open up, the intimacy between them, it all seemed too good to be true. He had been too perfect, too thoughtful, too attentive. She had been swept off her feet, and now, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. Jake had noticed the change in Maggie almost immediately. She was distant, her eyes clouded with something he couldn't quite decipher. She no longer returned his texts or calls with the same enthusiasm. It wasn't like her, and Jake could sense that something was wrong. At first, he told himself it was nothing, just her needing space to process things. He had been honest with her, hadn't he? But deep down, he knew something was off. The last thing he wanted was for her to pull away, especially now that he was starting to understand the depth of his feelings for her. It was Wednesday when he decided to confront her. He showed up at her apartment unannounced, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what he was going to say, but he couldn't take the silence any longer. He needed to see her, to understand what had happened, and to fix it, whatever it was. When Maggie opened the door, she seemed surprised but not pleased to see him. The warmth that had once been in her eyes was now replaced with guarded coldness. Jake, she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. Maggie, he replied, his voice strained. We need to talk. She crossed her arms, her stance defensive. About what? Jake took a deep breath, his words coming out rushed. About everything. I don't know what's going on, but I can feel it. Something's changed, and I need to know what it is. Maggie's gaze flickered for a moment before she looked away, her arms tightening across her chest. You know what it is, Jake, she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. I know what you've been doing. His heart sank. What are you talking about? Maggie's eyes shot back to his, sharp and full of accusation. The bet. The one you made with your friends. You don't care about me, Jake. You were never really interested. You were just playing a game. Jake's breath caught in his throat. She knew. He had hoped that the truth wouldn't come to light, that he could somehow work through this without exposing what he had done. But now, facing her, he realized just how much his actions had hurt her. Maggie, he stopped himself, unable to find the words to explain. It was a stupid bet. I know I shouldn't have agreed to it, but it wasn't what you think. I care about you. I didn't expect it to be like this. Maggie shook her head, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. You don't get it, Jake. You had your fun, you got close to me, and now you're just going to walk away like it was nothing. You never even gave me a chance. Jake's chest tightened. He hated the way she was looking at him, like he was the villain in her story. No. Maggie, you're wrong. I don't want to walk away. I never wanted this to hurt you. You should have thought about that before making a bet on my life, she shot back, her voice trembling. You think I don't see through it? You think I don't know how this works with men like you? Her words cut through him like a knife. She was right. He hadn't thought it through. In the pursuit of proving a point to his friends, he had lost sight of what really mattered, the woman standing in front of him. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice cracking. I should have never agreed to it. I should have told you sooner. I didn't think it would matter, but it does. You matter. Maggie laughed bitterly, her tears falling freely now. It matters now. How convenient. After all the damage has been done. You think I'm just going to forgive you because you say you care? You think an apology is enough to fix this? Jake reached for her, but she stepped back, her expression one of pure hurt. Don't, she said quietly. I don't need your pity. I don't pity you, Maggie, he said fiercely. I respect you. I admire you. I care about you more than I've cared about anything in a long time. She laughed again, the sound hollow. Well, I don't need your respect, Jake. I needed honesty. And now, it's too late. For a long moment, the two of them just stood there, the weight of everything they hadn't said filling the space between them. Jake didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to make things right. He had already ruined it, hadn't he? I never meant for any of this to hurt you, Jake said quietly, his voice full of regret. But I'm not going to let you walk away without trying to fix it. I'll do whatever it takes, Maggie. She looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and shaky. You can't fix this. You can't fix me. I need to fix myself first. With that, Maggie turned away, walking toward her bedroom, leaving Jake standing in the doorway, alone and uncertain. He stood there for a long time, unable to move, unable to find the words to make it better. Everything he had tried to build with her felt like it was slipping away, and all he could do was watch it happen. Jake stood motionless in the doorway, staring at the empty space where Maggie had been just moments before. The silence felt oppressive, as if the weight of his mistakes had filled every inch of the room. His mind raced, trying to piece together everything that had happened between them, the lies, the betrayal, the undeniable connection that had bloomed in spite of it all. How had it all gone so wrong? He ran a hand through his hair, pacing back and forth. He knew he had made a monumental mistake, but now that the truth was out, he couldn't undo the damage. He didn't want to give up on Maggie, not when he had finally found someone who made him feel more alive than he ever had before. But how could he fix it when she was so adamant that it was beyond repair? For the first time in his life, Jake felt completely powerless. All his money, his influence, his charm, they meant nothing in the face of the emotional wreckage he had caused. He had to talk to her again. He had to make her see that he wasn't the person she thought he was. But deep down, a gnawing fear tugged at him. What if it was too late? What if there was no coming back from this? Maggie locked the door behind her, leaning against it as she slid down to the floor. She could hear the muffled sound of Jake's footsteps outside her bedroom door, but she couldn't bring herself to face him again. The anger, the hurt, it was too much to process all at once. Her chest tightened, and she buried her face in her hands. How had she allowed herself to get so close to him? How could she have been so vulnerable, so trusting? She had always been careful with her heart, always kept it at arm's length. But with Jake, it had felt different. She had let down her guard, and now it felt like the world was crumbling around her. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She didn't need to look at it to know it was Jake. His messages had been flooding in all day, apologies, explanations, promises that he could never keep. But something stopped her from ignoring the screen this time. She picked it up, unlocking it slowly, and saw the latest message from him. Jake, Maggie, I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I've lost your trust, and I understand if you can't ever look at me the same way. But I need you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Please, give me a chance to make it right. Her breath hitched as she read the message. Part of her wanted to delete it without a second thought, but another part of her, the part that still cared, wanted to respond. To hear him out, to see if there was any truth to the words he had written. But was it enough? Could she really allow herself to be that vulnerable again, to let him back into her life after everything that had happened? Maggie placed the phone back down on the nightstand and curled up under the covers, hugging her knees to her chest. She needed time to figure out what she wanted, time to figure out if she could ever trust him again. But one thing was clear, she couldn't continue living in the limbo of uncertainty. She had to make a decision, whether to move forward without him or to try and salvage what they had started. Jake sat in his apartment late that night, his mind spinning with a million thoughts. He had tried calling Maggie several times, but each time, the call went straight to voicemail. His stomach twisted with frustration. He knew he had to give her space, but the waiting was killing him. He leaned back in his chair, looking out at the skyline once more. The city was alive with lights, the world moving on as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The life he had built, the person he thought he was, none of it mattered now. All that mattered was Maggie. And yet, it felt like he was losing her. His phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a notification from his best friend, Ryan. Ryan, dude, I've been hearing things. What's going on with you and Maggie? You don't look so hot. Jake's fingers hovered over the screen, his thoughts scattered. He knew Ryan was probably just trying to lighten the mood, but Jake couldn't bring himself to reply. How could he explain the mess he had made of things? How could he tell his best friend that he had ruined everything with the one woman who had made him question everything he thought he knew about himself? He sat in the silence, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. Maggie woke up the next morning with a pounding headache. She hadn't slept well, her mind replaying the events of the previous days over and over again. Jake's words, Emily's warning, her own confusion, it all felt like a whirlwind she couldn't escape. She got up, making her way to the kitchen, and poured herself a cup of coffee. The steam rose from the mug, but it didn't provide the comfort she usually found in her morning routine. Her thoughts drifted back to Jake and the messages he had sent her last night. Part of her wanted to respond, to give him a chance to explain, but another part of her feared that she would be letting herself be hurt all over again. Her phone buzzed, and she knew immediately who it was. She hesitated before reaching for it, taking a deep breath before opening his message. Jake, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from right now. But please know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. I just need one more chance to prove that I'm not the person you think I am. Please, Maggie. Maggie stared at the screen, her heart torn. She didn't know what to believe anymore. Was this just another empty promise, another excuse? Or was it something more? Was Jake truly trying to make amends, or was he simply saying what he thought she needed to hear? As she sat there, the weight of it all crashing over her, she realized something. She couldn't keep running from the truth. She couldn't keep hiding from her own feelings. She had to face the reality of the situation, whatever it was. And with that, Maggie made a decision. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions any longer. If she was going to move forward, she needed to do it with honesty, both with herself and with Jake. She took a deep breath and typed her reply. Maggie, we need to talk. Jake stared at his phone, his heart racing. He had been waiting for Maggie's response for days, and now it was here. A single sentence, but it carried so much weight. "We need to talk." The words felt like both a relief and a challenge. He had been desperate to speak to her, to explain himself, but what if this was it? What if this was the final chance, the one that would determine if there was any hope for them at all? He didn't hesitate. His fingers flew over the screen as he quickly typed a reply. "Jake, I'll be there in 30 minutes. I just need you to know, Maggie, that I'm sorry. I don't want to lose you." He hit send and immediately stood up, pacing in his apartment. His mind spun with 1,000 possible outcomes. What would she say? Would she even listen? Could he make her believe that he was genuinely sorry? That he truly wanted to be the man she deserved, the man he was capable of being? Maggie sat on the couch, her phone still in her hands. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before she finally placed it down. Her thoughts were a swirl of emotions, hurt, confusion, anger, but above all, uncertainty. She knew that she couldn't move forward until she had closure, until she had answers. But part of her feared that the answers would only bring more pain. She stared at the door as the minutes ticked by. Her heart fluttered with nervous anticipation. This conversation could change everything. She had no idea what to expect, but one thing was certain, this was the moment of truth. There was no turning back after this. 30 minutes later, Jake knocked on her door, his pulse racing. When Maggie opened the door, his breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful as always, but her eyes were tired, haunted, almost. She had clearly been through a lot, and it made him feel even worse for the pain he had caused her. She stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. He took a deep breath and walked in, his heart pounding in his chest. The air between them felt thick, heavy, like something unspoken was hanging in the balance. Neither of them spoke for a few moments. They simply stood there, facing each other, both unsure of where to begin. Finally, Maggie broke the silence. "Jake," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I need you to be honest with me. No more lies, no more excuses. I need to understand why. Why did you do it?" Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had been prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, he felt completely unprepared. He had no idea how to explain the depth of his actions without making them sound like a pathetic attempt to justify his behavior. But he owed her the truth, no matter how much it hurt. He began, then stopped. His words failed him, so he took a deep breath and tried again. "I didn't think it would matter. I didn't think I would fall for you. I thought it would be a stupid game with my friends, something that would be over before I knew it. I never imagined that I would care about you like this." Maggie's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "So, you didn't care at all? You just saw me as a challenge? A way to prove something to your friends?" "No," Jake said quickly, his voice urgent. "No, that's not it. I didn't care at first, but then I started to. I thought I could control it, that I could go through with it without getting hurt. But the more time we spent together, the more I realized how much I was lying to myself. You're incredible, Maggie. You're strong, kind, beautiful, and he cut himself off, his chest tight with emotion. "I messed up. I'm so sorry for hurting you." Maggie took a step back, her arms folded tightly across her chest as she processed his words. She was quiet for a long moment, as though weighing his apology against everything she had felt, the confusion, the pain, the sense of betrayal. "I don't know if I can believe you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Jake. You've already broken that trust. And I don't know if I can give you a second chance when it feels like everything was built on a lie." Jake's heart clenched at her words. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't even know if I deserve forgiveness. But I'm willing to fight for this, for us. I want to show you that I'm not the person I was before. I want to prove to you that I care, more than anything. Maggie shook her head slowly. But that's just it, Jake. You did care about something else, something more important than me. Your pride, your bet, your friends. All that came first. And now I'm supposed to believe that I'm the one who matters. Jake closed his eyes, his fists clenched at his sides. You're right. I put everything else before you. And I can't take that back. But I can show you, starting right now, that I'm willing to put you first. I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust, Maggie. I don't want to lose you. Please, don't give up on me just yet. The silence stretched between them again, thick and heavy, as Maggie looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of sincerity. She didn't want to believe him. She didn't want to open herself up to the possibility of more heartbreak. But the part of her that had fallen for him, the part that had wanted to believe in what they shared, was still there, lurking beneath the anger. I don't know, Jake, she said quietly. I just don't know if I can trust you again. I don't know if I'm strong enough to take that risk. Jake took a step forward, closing the distance between them. I'm asking you to take that risk, Maggie. I'm asking you to give me a chance to show you that I can be the man you deserve. I'll do whatever it takes. Just let me prove it. Maggie's gaze softened, but the doubt was still there, etched in her features. She looked away, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the couch. She was torn between the man who had betrayed her and the man who now stood before her, vulnerable and desperate for a chance. Let's take it one step at a time, she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. One step. I don't know what that means yet, but maybe we can figure it out. Jake nodded, a sense of relief flooding through him, though he knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of what would be a long, difficult road to rebuild their relationship. But for the first time in what felt like forever, there was hope. A small spark, a flicker of light. And for Jake, that was all he needed. Jake sat in the cafe, his fingers nervously tapping on the edge of his cup. He had been waiting for Maggie for almost 20 minutes. His mind was racing with every possible scenario of what might happen today. After their conversation last night, they had agreed to take things one step at a time, no promises, no grand gestures. Just time to rebuild what had been broken. And today, the first step was to meet again, but this time without the weight of lies hanging over them. He glanced at his watch again, his stomach tightening. He wanted to get this right, but he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what he did, he could still mess this up. It had taken so long to get Maggie to this point, agreeing to take it one step at a time, but was it enough? Could he truly rebuild her trust after everything that had happened? He took a deep breath, trying to calm the swirling thoughts in his head, but they refused to be quieted. He had lied to her, betrayed her, and hurt her in a way that left scars. He couldn't undo that. All he could do was show her, every single day, that he was worthy of her trust again. The door to the cafe opened, and Maggie walked in, her presence immediately commanding attention. Jake's heart skipped a beat. She looked beautiful, as always, but there was a guardedness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She walked over to his table, her gaze meeting his but then quickly averting it. "Hi," she said, her voice quiet. "Hey," Jake replied, standing up to pull out the chair for her. He was doing his best to keep things light, but it was hard. Everything felt so heavy, like the air itself was charged with unspoken words. She sat down, her posture stiff, and Jake followed suit. The two of them sat there for a moment, the silence between them thick and palpable. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was awkward. Both of them were unsure of how to move forward, what to say, how to act. Maggie broke the silence first. "So, how's work been?" she asked, her voice sounding casual, but Jake could hear the strain behind her words. "It's been okay," he said, offering a small smile. Busy, as always. But nothing I can't handle. How about you? Same, Maggie replied, her eyes scanning the room as if she were looking for something to distract her from the conversation. Just, trying to keep everything together. Jake's heart ached as he heard her words. He could see that she was trying to keep things light, but he knew the truth. She was still hurt. She was still figuring out what it all meant, and maybe, just maybe, she was still holding on to a small thread of hope. So, how are we doing? Jake asked carefully, wanting to gauge where they were in this fragile space they had found themselves in. Maggie hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. I'm not sure, she admitted, looking at him for the first time in what felt like forever. I'm trying, Jake. I really am. But, it's hard. I know, Jake said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. I know I've hurt you. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm willing to prove to you that I can be better. That I can be the person you thought I was. I won't give up, Maggie. Not this time. Maggie met his gaze, her expression conflicted. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him, but there was still that lingering doubt, that voice in her head telling her not to fall for the words, not to let her guard down too soon. She had been hurt before, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to risk it again. Why? She asked softly. Why do you want this so badly? After everything, why do you still want to make this work? Jake took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He had asked himself the same question 100 times, and the answer was simple. Because you're worth it. Because I've never felt the way I feel when I'm with you. I don't care about the bet anymore, Maggie. I never did. The moment I met you, everything changed. And I can't just walk away from that. I can't walk away from you. Maggie's throat tightened as she listened to his words. She could hear the truth in them, the sincerity that had been missing before. But still, a part of her hesitated. She wasn't sure she could completely let go of the past, the lies, the deception, the feeling of being manipulated. But Jake was different now, she could see that. He was willing to fight for them, and maybe that was what she needed to see all along. I'm not sure I can just forget everything, Jake, she said, her voice small. I can't pretend like it didn't happen. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to take it one day at a time, like we said. Jake's heart leaped at her words. It wasn't everything he had hoped for, but it was a start. A small step in the right direction. He reached across the table, his hand hovering just above hers, unsure if he had the right to touch her. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at him with a softness in her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. I won't let you down, Maggie, he said, his voice full of determination. I'll prove it to you, every day. As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, the tension between them slowly eased. They talked about their work, their favorite movies, their hopes for the future. The distance that had once felt like a chasm was now a little less daunting. Jake knew it would take time, but he could see that Maggie was beginning to let her guard down, little by little. And that was all he needed to hold on to. By the time they finished their coffee, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They were both scared. They both carried the weight of the past. But they also knew that they were willing to face it together, one step at a time. Maggie stood up to leave, and Jake followed her to the door. Before she stepped out into the bustling street, she turned back to him. There was a small smile on her lips, one that spoke of hope and cautious optimism. We'll see, Jake, she said softly. One day at a time. Jake nodded, his chest swelling with emotion. One day at a time, he echoed, knowing that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. Jake sat alone in his apartment, staring out the window at the bustling city below. He hadn't heard from Maggie in a couple of days. It wasn't a long time, but the silence felt like an eternity. The conversation they had shared in the cafe lingered in his mind, and for the first time in a long while, he had hope. Hope that they could rebuild what had been broken, step by step, but now, in the quiet of his apartment, he was uncertain. Was he doing enough? Was he being patient enough? Maggie had agreed to take things slowly, but what if he wasn't doing enough to show her that he had changed? He shook his head, trying to quiet the self-doubt that had started to creep back in. He was used to solving problems quickly, but this was different. Relationships didn't work on quick fixes or grand gestures, they worked on trust, consistency, and time. And time was the one thing he couldn't control. Maggie, on the other hand, sat in her apartment, replaying the events of their last meeting over and over in her mind. She had seen the sincerity in Jake's eyes, heard the rawness in his voice. But it didn't change the fact that she had been hurt, that she had trusted him and felt betrayed. She had agreed to take things slowly, but a part of her wondered if that was just a way of avoiding the inevitable, the realization that their relationship might never be the same. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. It was a beautiful afternoon, the kind of day where the world felt alive with possibility. But for Maggie, there was a weight in her chest, a lingering uncertainty that kept her from fully embracing the present. She had started to open herself up again, but what if it was too soon? What if she wasn't strong enough to move past the hurt? Her phone buzzed, and her heart skipped a beat. It was a message from Jake. "Jake, I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation. I don't want to pressure you, but I just wanted you to know that I'm here whenever you're ready to talk. No rush. Just take your time." Maggie stared at the message for a moment, feeling the weight of his words. She knew Jake was trying to be patient, trying to give her the space she needed. But what if this was it? What if, despite all the effort, they weren't meant to be? She hesitated for a moment before typing a reply. "Maggie, I appreciate that, Jake. I'm just, still trying to figure things out. It's not easy, but I'm trying." She pressed send, letting out a slow breath. She wasn't sure what she expected from the conversation. Maybe some kind of resolution, maybe an answer that would make everything clearer. But in reality, the path forward was still uncertain, and that made her anxious. Jake read her response and couldn't help but feel a wave of relief wash over him. Maggie was trying. She was still willing to engage, still willing to work through the mess they had created together. It wasn't a guarantee of anything, but it was a glimmer of hope, a sign that maybe, just maybe, things could improve. He quickly typed a response. "Jake, take all the time you need. I'll be here." He hit send and leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He had learned so much in the past few weeks, about Maggie, about himself, and about the importance of patience and understanding. If he was truly going to earn back her trust, he needed to prove it every single day. He had no illusion that things would go back to the way they were, but perhaps they didn't need to. Maybe they could build something new, something stronger. He didn't know how long it would take, but he was willing to give it everything he had. Over the next few days, their communication remained steady but slow. They exchanged a few messages here and there, each one a small step forward. Jake continued to show up at work, continued to be present in her life, but without rushing her or pushing her for more. He knew that every little action, every moment of patience, was a building block toward trust. And trust, he had come to understand, was the foundation of everything. Maggie, for her part, was still grappling with her feelings. She couldn't deny that there were moments when she felt a flicker of something, when she remembered the reasons she had fallen for Jake in the first place. He was kind, thoughtful, and yes, at times, reckless. But he had been there for her in ways that no one else had, and she couldn't ignore that. But every time she thought she was moving forward, she was reminded of the hurt, the betrayal, and the way he had broken her heart. The memories were still fresh, still painful, and she wasn't sure if she could ever fully erase them. What Jake had done wasn't something that could be undone with a few kind words and gestures. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way through this. She wasn't ready to give up, not yet. But she needed more time. More space to process the pain, the confusion, and the hope that was slowly beginning to take root. A week later, Jake invited Maggie to meet him again. This time, it was less formal, less pressure. Just two people sitting down for coffee, no expectations, no agenda. Maggie agreed, though she didn't feel the sense of urgency she had once felt. It wasn't about making everything right immediately, it was about taking small steps toward healing. They met at a small park cafe, the kind of place where the sounds of the city seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the hum of people going about their day. Maggie arrived first, sitting at a table by the window, her hands folded neatly in front of her as she waited for Jake. When he arrived, he smiled, and for a brief moment, things felt normal again. He sat down across from her, his eyes warm but cautious. They didn't need to say much at first. The comfortable silence between them was something they hadn't had in a long time. "So, how's work?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. "It's fine," Maggie said, shrugging. "Busy, as usual." Jake nodded. "Yeah, I know the feeling." The conversation flowed easily, much like it used to. They spoke about small things, movies, books, the weather, and for the first time in a while, Maggie found herself laughing at his jokes. She felt a small sense of ease creeping back into her, a reminder of the connection they once had. As they finished their coffee, Jake looked at her seriously. "I know we're taking this slow," he said. "But I just want you to know that I'm committed to this, Maggie. To us. Whatever it takes." Maggie met his gaze, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of something familiar, something close to hope. It was a small thing, but it was enough to keep her moving forward. "Okay," she said softly. "One day at a time." Jake smiled. One day at a time. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like they might just be able to build something new together. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act. Jake and Maggie were treading carefully, each of them aware of the fragile nature of what they were rebuilding. They spent more time together, but it was always on neutral ground, simple dates, shared lunches, moments of conversation. They talked about everything and nothing. It wasn't the fiery, passionate connection they had once shared, but it was a start. Every day felt like a small victory, but neither of them was ready to throw themselves back into the whirlwind of a relationship. Jake found himself constantly second-guessing his actions. Was he being patient enough? Was he showing Maggie enough support without overwhelming her? He was always looking for signs that she was truly ready to open up, but each time, he reminded himself that this wasn't about rushing. He had to trust that Maggie would take the steps when she was ready. Maggie, too, found herself walking a fine line. She had agreed to take things slowly, but that didn't mean the doubts were gone. Every time they were together, she felt the old connection, the familiarity of Jake's presence, but she also felt the weight of the past, looming like a shadow. The lies, the hurt, the betrayal, it was always there, lurking beneath the surface, threatening to pull her away from the fragile hope she was beginning to nurture. She had started to see Jake in a different light. He wasn't the man who had played with her heart for a bet. He was trying, really trying, to show her that he had changed. She didn't know if she could trust it completely, but she was willing to allow herself to see the possibility. It was a Thursday afternoon when the test came. Jake had invited Maggie to dinner at a small, intimate restaurant in the city. It was a place he used to go to when he was younger, before everything had become complicated. The kind of place where the waiters greeted you like old friends, and the food was simple but delicious. He wanted to take her somewhere that felt real, no glitz, no glamour, just a quiet moment between them. As they sat down at their table, a nervous energy hung in the air. Maggie hadn't agreed to go on a dinner date with him in a while. The casual meetups were fine, but this felt different. This felt more serious. Jake noticed how her hands were clenched on her lap, and the way her gaze kept shifting from him to the menu, as if she were looking for something to hold on to. "You okay?" Jake asked softly, leaning forward slightly. "You seem a little tense." Maggie smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "Just thinking." Jake nodded, but he could tell she wasn't entirely there. The familiar feeling of doubt crept in. Was she really ready for this? Had he been rushing her without even realizing it? The waiter came to take their orders, and Jake did his best to keep the conversation light. They discussed their days, joked about the weather, and even reminisced about silly things from the past. It wasn't until the main course arrived that the tension began to bubble to the surface. Maggie picked at her food, her appetite clearly absent. Jake watched her for a moment, then set his fork down. "Maggie, we need to talk," he said, his tone more serious than he intended. Her eyes widened slightly, and she paused, a flicker of concern passing over her face. "What about?" "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About us. And I know we agreed to take it slow, but I need to ask. Are you still in this? Or are you just going through the motions?" Maggie's heart skipped a beat. His words hit her harder than she expected. For all the progress they had made, all the cautious steps forward, she hadn't allowed herself to truly confront what was at stake. She had been holding back, unsure of whether she was truly ready to dive back into something so fragile, so complicated. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice low. "I've been thinking a lot too. And I guess I'm still scared. I don't want to go back to the way things were. But I don't know how to move forward." Jake felt a pang in his chest. He had expected something like this, but hearing it from her still stung. "I don't want you to feel pressured, Maggie. I really don't. But I also want you to know that I'm here, no matter what. I'm not going anywhere." Maggie looked down at her plate, her thoughts racing. She had always believed that relationships were about the big moments, the declarations of love, the grand gestures, but this was different. This wasn't about fireworks or passion, it was about trust, and it was about time. Was she willing to take the risk? Was she ready to trust him again, despite the pain he had caused her? "Jake," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I want to be here. I do. But I'm not sure if I'm ready to let myself love you again. Not yet." The words hung in the air, and Jake felt his heart break. But he knew better than to push her. He had learned that much from their journey. Instead of reacting with frustration or anger, he simply nodded. "That's okay," he said softly. "I'll wait. I don't mind waiting, Maggie. I'll wait as long as it takes." Maggie met his gaze, her heart aching with the sincerity in his eyes. It wasn't a love story of dramatic confessions and quick resolutions. It was messy, slow, and painfully honest. But as she looked at Jake, she felt a sense of peace, maybe even hope. Hope that, in time, they could figure this out together. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. The simple touch was more meaningful than any words they could say. "I don't know where this will go," she said quietly, "but I'm willing to find out." Jake squeezed her hand gently, feeling the warmth of her touch. It wasn't the promise he had hoped for, but it was a start that was more meaningful than any grand gesture. They weren't rushing forward. They weren't pretending everything was okay. But they were moving forward, one day at a time. The evening ended on a bittersweet note, with both of them knowing that the road ahead would still be challenging. But as they walked out into the cool night air, they shared a quiet moment together, their fingers intertwined. For the first time in a long while, it felt like they were walking in the same direction. And though the journey ahead wasn't clear, one thing was certain, they were no longer alone. The next few weeks brought a sense of calm, a rhythm that both Jake and Maggie were beginning to appreciate. They continued to meet on their own terms, taking things slowly and enjoying the small victories along the way. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the past seemed too heavy to bear, but they were making progress. Jake had learned the value of patience, and Maggie had learned to open up, little by little. The foundation was being built, brick by brick. However, life, as it often does, had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected it. It was a Monday morning when Jake received a call that would change everything. He was sitting at his desk at work, a cup of coffee in hand, when his phone rang. It was an unknown number, and he hesitated before answering. He wasn't expecting any calls, especially not from numbers he didn't recognize. "Hello?" Jake answered, his voice steady. "Jake Thompson," a stern voice on the other end of the line asked. "Yeah, speaking. Who's this?" "This is Sarah Nelson, and I'm calling from the office of Gregory Davis. I need to inform you of an urgent matter regarding your recent actions." Jake's heart sank. He recognized the name immediately. Gregory Davis was one of the wealthiest and most influential businessmen in the city, someone whose name carried weight in the corporate world. Jake's association with him was limited, but the implications of that connection were far-reaching. "What's this about?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice calm, though he could feel his anxiety building. "You've been named in a lawsuit," Sarah continued. "A serious one. It's in regards to the bet you made involving your personal life. Mr. Davis is not pleased with how things have unfolded, and he has decided to take legal action." Jake froze. The bet. The one that had started this entire mess, the bet that had turned his world upside down. He hadn't thought about it in months, hadn't even considered the possibility that there might still be consequences. He felt a wave of panic wash over him. "What do you mean, a lawsuit?" he asked, his voice now shaky. "That was just a stupid bet. It's over. That's in the past." "Mr. Davis doesn't see it that way," Sarah said bluntly. "He believes your actions have caused significant damage to his reputation. There are financial and personal repercussions, and he's holding you accountable." Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to process the words. He had been so focused on his relationship with Maggie, on trying to make things right, that he hadn't realized the full extent of the fallout from his past. This wasn't just about Maggie anymore, it was about his entire career, his reputation, his future. "I don't know what to say," Jake stammered. "I had no idea this was still an issue." "We'll be in touch with further details," Sarah said before ending the call. Jake sat back in his chair, stunned. The weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. The bet. His past mistakes. Everything he had tried to leave behind was now coming back to haunt him in the worst possible way. Later that evening, when Jake and Maggie met for dinner, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest. Maggie could sense that something was off, but she didn't know what. She had been hoping that things were moving in a positive direction, that the worst was behind them. "You okay?" Maggie asked, watching him closely as they sat down at their usual table. Jake nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired. Work's been a little hectic." Maggie raised an eyebrow but didn't push. She could tell that there was something more, but Jake wasn't ready to talk about it. They ate their meal in relative silence, but the quiet tension between them was palpable. Jake was grateful for her presence, but his mind kept racing. What was he going to do? How was he going to fix this? This lawsuit could destroy everything he had worked for, and the consequences would likely ripple through every part of his life. Maggie noticed that he wasn't eating much, his gaze distant as he poked at his food. "Jake, what's really going on?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "You're not yourself tonight." Jake hesitated for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. "There's something I need to tell you." Maggie's heart skipped a beat, and she put down her fork, her full attention now on him. She could tell this was serious. "What is it?" "I'm being sued," Jake said, his voice heavy with frustration. By Gregory Davis. Maggie blinked, confused. Gregory Davis? The businessman? Jake nodded. Yeah. It's because of that bet, the one I made about, well, everything. He's suing me for damages to his reputation, financial and personal. I didn't even know it was still an issue, but now it is. And it's not just some silly bet anymore. This could ruin me, Maggie. Maggie sat back in her chair, the weight of his words sinking in. She could see the tension in his face, the worry in his eyes. She knew Jake had made mistakes, but she had never imagined that something like this could come back to haunt him so harshly. Jake, Maggie said softly, her heart heavy with empathy, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Jake ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. I didn't either. I thought it was over. But now, it's affecting everything. My reputation. My job. And it's all my fault. I never meant for any of this to happen. I just wanted to move on, to fix things with you. Maggie reached across the table, placing her hand over his. You don't have to face this alone, Jake. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. Together. Jake met her gaze, a flicker of relief passing through him. It wasn't a solution, but hearing her say those words, hearing her offer support in the face of something so overwhelming, meant everything to him. I don't know how this will all play out, Jake admitted, his voice quieter now. But I'm not giving up on you, Maggie. On us. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right, even if it means facing the consequences of my past. Maggie squeezed his hand, offering him a reassuring smile. We'll take it one step at a time, Jake. That's all we can do. And for the first time that evening, Jake felt a spark of hope. Maybe the road ahead was going to be difficult, but at least he wasn't walking it alone. The following days were a blur of phone calls, meetings with lawyers, and endless paperwork. Jake found himself caught in a whirlwind of stress, each moment more overwhelming than the last. The lawsuit filed by Gregory Davis wasn't just a corporate matter, it was a personal attack. The stakes had never been higher, and Jake knew that this was a battle he couldn't fight alone. Every time he spoke to his lawyers, the reality of the situation became more and more clear. Gregory Davis was a powerful man with connections in every corner of the business world. His reputation was his most valuable asset, and Jake's actions had threatened to tarnish that. The legal battle was going to be long, and it was likely to cost Jake everything he had worked for, his career, his financial security, and his standing in the business world. But the worst part wasn't the looming threat to his career. It was the fact that Maggie was involved, whether she realized it or not. Her name had been dragged into the mess because of their past relationship, and Jake couldn't bear the thought of her suffering because of his mistakes. She had already been hurt once by his foolishness, and now, it seemed that the damage could be irreversible. One afternoon, as Jake sat in his office, buried under a mountain of legal documents, his phone rang again. It was Maggie. Hey, Jake answered, his voice weary. What's up? I need to talk to you, Maggie said, her tone uncharacteristically serious. Can you meet me after work? Jake's stomach tightened. He had been avoiding this, avoiding the moment when Maggie would finally confront the reality of the situation. He had promised to be honest with her, but that didn't make it any easier. Yeah, of course, Jake replied, trying to sound calm. Where do you want to meet? How about that cafe we went to a few weeks ago? Maggie suggested. It's quiet, and I think we need to talk. I'll be there, Jake said, though his heart was already heavy with the weight of the conversation that was about to unfold. When Jake arrived at the cafe, he found Maggie sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Her gaze was distant, and she looked more serious than he had ever seen her. As he approached, she looked up, and for the first time in a long while, Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Hey, he said softly, sitting down across from her. How are you? Maggie didn't immediately answer. Instead, she placed her mug down and folded her hands on the table. I've been thinking a lot about everything. About us, about the lawsuit, about what this is all doing to both of us. Jake nodded, his chest tightening. I know it's a lot. And I'm so sorry for bringing you into this. I never meant for it to go this far. Maggie shook her head, cutting him off. It's not just about that. It's not just about the lawsuit or the bet. I've been thinking about us, Jake. About what we've been through and what we're still going through. And I realized something. She paused, looking directly into his eyes. I can't be with you out of pity or obligation. I need to know that you've really changed, that you're not just doing this to fix what's broken in your life. I need to know that this is real, that you're not just trying to save face. Jake's heart sank. He had known that this conversation was coming, but hearing Maggie's words still hit him hard. She wasn't blaming him for everything. She wasn't holding him entirely responsible. But she needed more. She needed to see the man he had become, not just the man who had hurt her. I get it, Jake said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. I know that I've made mistakes, huge ones. And I don't want you to feel like I'm asking for a second chance just because my life's falling apart. I'm asking because I love you, Maggie. And I'm not the same person I was when I made that bet. I'm trying to be better, for you and for myself. Maggie looked down at her hands, her thoughts clearly racing. Jake could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of being hurt again was still there, deep down. I've been thinking about what it would mean if we tried again, Maggie said, her voice soft but firm. And honestly, I don't know if I'm ready for that. I don't know if I can trust you again, completely. It's not about the bet, Jake. It's about everything else, the lies, the manipulation, the games we played with each other's hearts. It's all still there. Jake swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud, hearing the raw honesty in her voice, made him realize just how far they still had to go. I'm not asking for everything to be fixed overnight, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm just asking for the chance to prove that I've changed. That I can be the man you deserve. Maggie looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face. It was as if she were looking for some sign, some hint that he was telling the truth, that he was truly different. And as she looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in him for a long time, vulnerability. Jake was no longer the cocky, confident man who had made a bet with her life. He was someone who was trying to fix the mess he had made, who was fighting for redemption. I want to believe you, Jake, Maggie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But I need time. I need to know that this isn't just about fixing your reputation, that it's about us. And I need to see that you're not going to give up when things get hard. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of her words. I won't give up. I'll keep fighting. But I'll give you the time you need. I promise. As they sat there in silence, the world around them seemed to fade away. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he was on the right path, not just with his career, not just with the lawsuit, but with Maggie. He knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but he was ready to face them. And as Maggie reached across the table to take his hand, Jake knew that they were both in this together, no matter what the future held. The days that followed were filled with a strange kind of quiet. The chaos of the lawsuit continued to loom over Jake, but Maggie's decision to give him space to prove himself had changed the tone of their relationship. They no longer rushed into things, no longer tried to force a connection that wasn't ready to happen. Instead, they allowed themselves to move at their own pace, with Jake focusing on his work, his personal growth, and doing everything he could to fix the damage he had caused. However, the pressure was undeniable. Every time Jake walked into a courtroom or sat down with his lawyers, he was reminded of the precariousness of the situation. Gregory Davis's influence was far-reaching, and the lawsuit was only growing in complexity. But as stressful as the days were, Jake had one thing that made all the difference: Maggie. It was a cold Tuesday morning when Jake received the call. He had been expecting it, there had been whispers that a resolution was near, but nothing could have prepared him for what he heard. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah Nelson's voice was cold over the phone. "We've come to a settlement agreement. Gregory Davis is willing to drop the lawsuit, but the conditions are complicated." Jake's heart raced as he tried to process the words. "What do you mean, complicated?" "There's a condition attached to the settlement. Davis wants a public apology, a statement acknowledging his role in the matter and the damage to his reputation. And there's a deadline, a very tight one. If you don't comply, the lawsuit will continue, and we'll be back in court." Jake's pulse quickened. A public apology? The thought of admitting his mistakes in front of the world, of calling attention to the past that had already caused so much pain, made him feel sick. But he also knew that this might be his only chance to make things right, to end the legal battle before it completely consumed him. "I'll need to think about this," Jake said, his voice tight. "But if I go through with it, what happens next?" "There will be no further legal action if the apology is issued on time. You'll be free of the lawsuit," Sarah replied, but there was a certain coldness in her words, as if the deal was just another business transaction to her. Jake hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the decision press down on him. He had spent months trying to fix his relationship with Maggie, trying to redeem himself in her eyes. Could he really sacrifice everything in order to settle the lawsuit? Later that evening, Jake sat down with Maggie at their favorite cafe. She could sense the tension in his body, the way his hands fidgeted with his coffee cup. "Jake, what's going on?" she asked gently, her eyes searching his face. He let out a long sigh. "I got the call from my lawyers. They've made an offer, a settlement from Gregory Davis. But it comes with a catch: I have to make a public apology." Maggie's brow furrowed. "A public apology? What does that mean?" Jake hesitated, not wanting to overwhelm her. "It means I have to publicly admit that I was wrong, that my actions hurt his reputation and caused harm. It'll be all over the news, Maggie. Everyone will know." Maggie leaned back, her gaze never leaving his. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the vulnerability he had shown her time and time again. "Jake, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. You don't owe him anything." "I do owe him something," Jake replied, his voice firm. "I was the one who made the bet. I was the one who started all of this. And I know I hurt you, and him, and a lot of people along the way. If this is what it takes to make things right, I'll do it. I need to fix this." Maggie sat quietly for a moment, processing his words. She knew Jake was right, he had made a mistake, and the consequences were real. But a public apology, something that would bring everything back into the spotlight, was that really the right decision? "Jake," Maggie finally said, her voice steady, "you've been doing everything you can to fix things. You've been trying to prove that you're not the same person you were. But I don't want you to feel like you have to sacrifice everything just to make things right. I want you to do what feels true to you, not just what others expect of you." Jake looked at her, his chest tightening. He had never felt so torn in his life. He wanted to do what was best for her, for them. He wanted to put the past behind them and start fresh. But this one decision could change everything. "I just don't know if I can live with the guilt if I don't do it," Jake admitted, his voice raw. "I've already hurt too many people, Maggie. If I don't take responsibility, I'm going to keep living in that shadow." Maggie reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Jake, I get it. You're trying to do the right thing. But I want you to know that you're not alone in this. Whatever you choose, I'll be right here with you. You're more than just the mistakes you've made." Jake squeezed her hand, feeling a sense of relief flood through him. Maggie wasn't asking him to be perfect. She wasn't asking for the impossible. She was asking him to be himself, and that, in itself, was a victory. The next morning, Jake stood in front of a camera, a microphone clipped to his shirt, as a room full of reporters waited for him to speak. His lawyer, Sarah Nelson, stood beside him, her expression as impassive as ever. The press conference had been arranged quickly, a public display of his apology, something that Jake had never imagined he would have to do. He cleared his throat, glancing down at the prepared statement in his hands. The words felt foreign, distant, and yet he knew that this was the moment that would define everything. He couldn't undo what had been done, but he could take responsibility for it. He could own it. "Good morning," Jake began, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. "I stand before you today to address my actions. I made a bet, one that should never have been made. I thought I could control the outcome, but in doing so, I hurt people. I hurt Gregory Davis. I hurt the people I care about. And most importantly, I hurt Maggie, who deserved better from me." He paused, looking directly at the cameras. "I take full responsibility for my actions. I want to make it clear that no one else is to blame. The mistakes I made are mine, and I am committed to doing everything I can to make amends." The words felt heavy, but as he spoke them, Jake realized something profound. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of his true redemption. He wasn't just apologizing to Gregory Davis or the public, he was apologizing to himself. He was finally accepting that his past mistakes didn't define him, but the choices he made moving forward would. A week later, the lawsuit was settled, the tension that had been hanging over Jake finally lifted. The fallout from the public apology was manageable, and though his reputation had taken a hit, he knew it would heal in time. What mattered most was that he had done what he needed to do, he had taken ownership of his past and was now focused on building a future, one that included Maggie. And when they stood together at the end of that week, hand in hand, Maggie looking up at him with a smile, Jake knew that the real battle wasn't over, it was just beginning. They were both starting anew, with a clean slate and the possibility of something beautiful. The journey was far from easy, but it was theirs. Together. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?